We're going to do a little bit of a review, but before we do that, we're going to introduce the topic today is Hurtin for certain. How do I deal with suffering? How do I deal with suffering, right? So, but let's just kind of rewind a bit to make sure we're all on the same page. You can kind of move the slide back. Uh-oh, looks like we got a little bit of a technical difficulty going back there. I think it starts at around 80, something like that, so you can slide back. But let's just keep focused. Thank you, one of these. So what was principle one? That's all we're doing now anyways. Audience of one. And what question do we ask? Who or what do I worship? Right, so we talked about that in that audience of one. So then principle two is what? Inside game, right. I think that's what y'all said. And what was the question there? What motivates me, right? And that comes out of this aspect of identity. So then that was yesterday. Then today we focused on principle three, which is holy sweat, holy surrender, asking the question what? How do I grow? How do I grow? And then lastly, now we're here at principle four with this issue of suffering, right? Because that's one thing that happens in all of our lives, and something that we looked into the life of Joseph in the Bible, someone who gives us an incredible picture of both suffering, how to overcome it, and how to lean into God when bad things happen. So you can go ahead and skip to the video now. That's where we are. Want to check this out and just look at this issue of suffering a little bit closer. Yep, keep it moving. We did this part already, too. Here we go.
It's not how you start, it's how you finish. And it's not where you're from, it's where you're at. Everybody gets knocked down. Everybody gets knocked down. How quick are you gonna get up? How quick are you gonna get up? Everybody gets knocked down. Everybody gets knocked down. How quick are you gonna get up? Just how are you gonna get up?
Yeah. Provocative statement in the song. Everybody gets knocked down. Fact of life. The question is, how fast are you going to get up? You know, and there was a great poet and philosopher who also was an athlete who made a statement this way. He was a boxer, actually, and he was so dominant in his sport that the reporters will often ask his opponents, well, how do you plan on stopping him? See, he was undefeated. And one of his opponents, said, well, I noticed he's a bit shorter than me, so I plan to use my reach and my length to my advantage to keep him at bay and continue to, beat him. And that's how I'm going to take him out. So then, as they often do in the press, they go back to this champion, poet, philosopher, and they ask him, well, what do you think about his strategy? What do you think about his plan? Because he has a plan for taking you out, champ. And this is what he said. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. I know who I'm talking about? That's Iron Mike Tyson, the great poet, philosopher, who said that. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. What are you going to do when life punches you in the mouth? Well, we looked at the life of Joseph and saw a couple times when he got hit. pretty hard, right? We saw in Genesis chapter 37, and we realized that he's a dreamer, and he, as a young one, he was the youngest of his brothers, and he, had dreams, and he was his father's favorite. And eventually they just got so jealous and angry at him, and he was kind of a brat. Anybody got like younger siblings that you feel like kind of be bratty, right? Yeah, some of y'all can relate to that. And so they decide, you know what, let's just take care of him. Let's just get rid of him. And so they end up selling him into slavery. Then in slavery, he makes the best of that situation and ends up getting promoted in the house to basically manager over the whole house. And then Potiphar, the master, he leaves, and his wife says, come on, let's do our thing. My husband's not around. Let's get it on, Joseph. And he's like, whoa, I can't do this. This is wrong. So then she accuses him of rape. Potiphar believes his wife. So now he's in jail. Now he gets put in the prison. And in the prison, he has these dreams. He ends up interpreting Pharaoh's dreams and gives him on high alert because of, God's grace in his life. He says, look, this is what's about to happen. You're about to have a famine for 7 years after 7 years of plenty. So this is what you need to do. Save up right now because in 7 years a famine's coming. And Pharaoh ends up saying, you know what, you're the man. Since you see this and you were able to interpret my dream for me, I'm going to put you in charge of the relief effort. So Joseph gets put in the relief effort. Things are going well. And then all of a sudden, his brothers show up. The same ones that just years ago, 13 years ago, kicked him into a pit and left him for dead, sold him into slavery. Now they come to him in need of food. They don't recognize him. They don't know it's him at first. And it's like, man, ultimate payback time, right? What do we do? How did he respond? And we see at the end of the story, he forgives his brothers. They reconcile, and he ends up helping save the whole nation of Israel and all the people around as a result of that. But we're going to unpack 3 points that we get from Joseph's life and his story, and how that applies to sport and how that applies to us today. And the first one is the reality. And the reality is that life outside of the garden is broken and inevitably involves suffering. Now, we talked about in the garden, you heard Reza mention that the first night, right? And we talked about this, the beautiful place that it started where God gave Adam and Eve everything they could have wanted and needed, and there was complete fellowship with God and each other, and everything was all good. It was the only time in history where someone could accurately say, it's all good. And then sin entered the world. They were deceived by Satan, and ever since that moment they were cast out of the garden, suffering has been a part of the process. And so it's just a reality that we all face. I mean, raise your hand if you've not ever in your life experienced anything like pain or suffering. Raise your hand. You've never experienced that. Nothing. Yeah. I mean, we come out of the womb crying now, right? I mean, this starts from birth. And so, but what do we mean by suffering? Suffering, we mean the pain that you experience as a result of a trial. Now, pain is just something that it hurts, right? It's something that you feel. That doesn't always have to be physical. Oftentimes, the most painful things are even emotional, psychological. But it's something that hurts. And then a trial is something circumstantially difficult that happens to you. A situation, and going back to Joseph, right? This trial of being sold into slavery by his own flesh and blood. This trial being wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit. This crime then of being just forgotten about by the guy he first interpreted his dream. So these circumstances, these issues that he had all around him. And as we look at that, we also see that where this suffering and pain comes from. Because remember, the fall didn't just happen. Adam and Eve didn't just decide one day, hey, that looks like a good tree to eat. They were tempted by Satan. And there's an interesting line in the movie Usual Suspects where the guy says the greatest trick the devil pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. Because if I don't even believe you exist, then I don't even have any defenses up against what you're going to do. But there's several things that Satan is called on as doing and is responsible for in the world around us. One, he is the author of brokenness and suffering. The Bible tells us several important things. He has limited power, but his influence is great. And ultimately, we get the full picture of Satan's demise after the cross of Christ and his resurrection. But in the meantime, this world, he still has influence over, even though it's limited. His mission is simple: to steal, kill, and destroy. To steal our joy, to kill us, to destroy our testimonies. That's what the plan is. That's what his goal is. 1 Peter 5:8 says, the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And yet, at the same time, while it is true that he has limited power and influence, while his mission is to steal, kill, and destroy, the other reality is that he shouldn't be used as an excuse for your own personal bad choices. So let me break that down for you, right? So what that means is you got a final that's coming up like on Monday. You decide to like party on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You get to the test, you're like, oh, the devil don't want me to make it out of college. He's trying to stop me. No. Don't blame him for that. That was you. You made that decision. See, just like in the case of Adam and Eve, all he can do is present the option to kind of tempt you, but he can't make you do something you don't want to do. So it can't be used as an excuse, although there is temptation that is all around us. Now, it's also worth noting that suffering itself is complex and comes at us from many different directions. And we saw this in Joseph's life as well, right? There's personal choices. I mean, Joseph, we get the sense in the text that he didn't just kind of matter-of-factly report the fact that he had a dream in which his older brothers were bowing down to him, right? He kind of threw it in their face a little bit, reveled in the fact that he was his father's favorite. And so there were some ways in which he kind of stirred the pot, and there were some choices that he made. But then beyond that, suffering is also the cause of other people's choices. Not saying that it was his fault and he should have been thrown into a pit. And initially they planned on killing him. And sometimes we experience hard times as a result of choices that other people make. A divorce, in a split up of our parents, a betrayal of a friend. Things that we didn't have anything to do with, but they happened because of other people's choices. And then lastly, there are different circumstances. There's just situations and circumstances that occur in life that you had no control over either. For example, an athletic director gets fired, a coach, just leaves. And all of a sudden, the very program and the system that you had and why the person that recruited you there and the vision that they had for you was gone, and you had nothing to do with it. And situations change. I've seen, we see natural disasters. Nobody's fault. An earthquake happens. A storm. These things occur and they cause suffering. So here's the key, though. The challenge is not simply to avoid or manage suffering, but to lean into God when we encounter it. And that's what this principle is all about. That because it's guaranteed that we will suffer, the question is, how will I respond? Will I move toward God to get closer to him and lean on him in the midst of my suffering? Or will I move away and decide to use other things to cope? That's really the only question that is before us. So we talked about the reality, right? But the next principle, the next part of this is the response. What is our response to suffering? And the ultimate response that we want to have, that we're appealing to have, is that trusting God's sovereignty is the best response for suffering. Now, obviously implied in that is there are multiple options that you have. But trusting God's sovereignty is the best. Now, sovereignty is a big word. What does that mean? Sovereignty is to reign or to rule over all. In this case, it means that God is in control of everything that happens in the world, and that nothing happens to me or you that he doesn't first allow. He is in control, he is all powerful, and he wins in the end. This is the information that we have. This is the story that we were refreshed and reminded of on Sunday and all throughout the scriptures. That ultimately he wins and he's in control. And yet, at the same time, our response to that truth is what's key, right? Because God's love and power anchors his followers even in the face of suffering. And we see this in the life of Joseph. Somehow, he still maintained in the midst of all of these trials and hardships that he faced, he still was able to have this trust in God that carried him along the way. So, here's the big piece. God's promises to bring about good in every circumstance for those who love him. He promises this. Romans 8:28, right? For we know this, that God works to the good of all things, for those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Now, the key, though, is that what is good? Because we look at our lives and our situations and go, that injury was not good. You know, that getting benched was not good. That painful breakup was not good. So what do we mean by good? Well, this goes back to the sovereignty issue. Not good according to your standards or my standards, good concerning God's standards. It's his definition. And sometimes that good has an ultimate purpose in mind that's beyond that, right? Because burpees never feel like a good thing. That never seems to be in my plan of what good is. But at the same time, if I want to get conditioning, if I want to get some core strength, then I might want to do some of that. Those extra laps, they don't seem like my good, but there's a bigger picture involved. Now, with exercise, we can kind of wrap our heads around it for a little bit because we can see a payoff coming. We can look in the mirror and go, yeah, right? But in God's case, he doesn't always allow us to understand why we suffer or how it'll work out. We don't always get to see all of what's going on. Sometimes it just feels like a massive confusion that just happened. And I have no idea how anything positive can come from this. But this is where the faith comes in, that somehow, some way, God can turn every situation into something positive, even though I can't see it. And this is what Joseph held on to as he was languishing in this prison, thinking like, I'm now interpreting other people's dreams, but yet 13 years ago I had one, and what's happened to it? This is not what I had in mind. So we have to believe and trust that God knows what he's doing even when we don't. In Isaiah 55, verse 8 and 9, God reminds us that his ways are not like our ways, nor are his thoughts like our thoughts. When you've been around forever and you've learned how to create a world and moons and stars and oceans and sands, then maybe we might be in a position to question some of his decisions. But in the meantime, it's like, okay, God, let me trust you. So I mentioned earlier, right? So one of the most difficult experiences, not just at that time in my life, but even growing up without my biological father around, and how hard that was, and how I didn't see any possible way that this could have been a good thing, right? And even as I began to grow in my faith and feel like, man, this picture of God as a father, like this is hard for me to grasp. But then an interesting thing happened. Some of you guys, you saw my family earlier, and when I married my wife, she already had our daughter, Ariana, so I was her stepfather, but her father wasn't in the picture. And I remember thinking, like, I don't want her to experience what I did. And so my desire to be a good father and to be very intentional about being influential in her life had everything to do with what happened to me. God allowed me to experience that so I could then fill in the gap for somebody else. And so now I didn't know that at 6, at 7, at 8, at 10, at 20. But eventually God's plan came into existence, and I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful to play that role. But this is why it's so key about how we respond to suffering, because it reveals if we trust in God and his promises or not, right? You realize this as athletes. You know if really buying into the coach's game plan when it doesn't seem to be working at all and everything seems to be going wrong. And it's like, do I go back to my own tendencies? I know he told me to pass the ball a lot and distribute more, but, we losing by like 20, so let me start jacking up a few. You start to learn, it's like, do I want to play hero? Do I want to, I'm running, and I remember I used to run cross country, and, like the big meet, the biggest challenge and temptation in the championship meet, and, cross country people, y'all could, and even track, y'all get this too, is to come out the gates too fast. And they always be like, look, pace yourself, don't give it, your juices are going, and you just want to go, and you see the other people in front of you, and then you see people hit that wall, and you go, yeah, see, I should have listened to coach. He told me to pace myself, but I didn't do it. So we get this. But will we trust in the coach when, the fire gets ramped up? And so there are 3 responses to suffering, that we can have. One is, do we get bitter or do we get better? That's really the first one. You can easily start to get bitter and to get pouty and complain. And right? You know what's going on internally when you look at the depth chart, and now all of a sudden you're like further down the line or something, and you just start to complain. In your heart, you just resent life or resent other people that don't have what you have, and you start to get bitter. Or you can use the same situation to make you better. Joseph, we see, continued to do the right thing and put himself in a position where whenever God's vision for his life was going to be revealed, he would be ready. But that's a choice that we have to make, to be bitter or better. The other one is revenge or release. Now, again, this can also get tough in the heat of competition, right? But because it's easy to lash out and get revenge. Somebody takes a cheap shot. Ref didn't see it. Somebody in your life, in your personal life, does something bad, talks about you behind your back. What do you do in that moment? And Christ gives us the ability to do the unthinkable to the world and actually forgive. And the interesting thing about release is that when you hold on to something, you're also preoccupied as well. And oftentimes, the vengeance has this ability to keep us stuck in the past as opposed to letting it go and being able to move on. And so revenge or release is another one. And then lastly, medicate or meditate. And I want to spend a little bit of time here because medicating the pain of suffering is the easiest thing in the world to do. It's easy to, and we know all the list of the things that we use to medicate ourselves, right? Drinking, alcohol, that's a big one I've seen in my family when I was growing up. Just the pain and the hardship that people felt, and it's just like, look, let me just throw a few back, get intoxicated, so a place where I don't have to just think about these hard times anymore. Especially when people, you may lose somebody or something hard happens. And nowadays it's beyond alcohol, right? I mean, drugs, whatever. Sex and being with people. Can't be alone. Let me just get this sense of medication. Let me get this feeling of loneliness, of alienation that I have out of me by being with somebody else. And ultimately what that's about is, instead of relying on the truth that God has said, you are significant, you are secure, it's like I don't really believe, I'm not leaning on that, so let me lean on somebody else thinking of me in that way, or at least telling me that. And so as a result, we medicate with sex. We medicate with the attention and the approval of other people. We know if we put that jacket on and go into the cafeteria, some people are going to notice. We know that if we just kind of put ourselves out there and become the life of the party, that we'll get that affirmation that we want. And it's this way of medicating to alleviate the pain and the suffering that we're experiencing is so tempting. And as I was praying about this time, I just really sensed, like a sense from the Lord that some of you here, you were struggling with this. Because we live in a world that worships sports, and there's two things that we're good at worshiping right now in this country: sports and sex. And the interesting thing about sex is they kind of come together, right? Because there's body and sexuality and all. And so you're kind of at the eye of the storm by being collegiate athletes in a culture that worships this to a high degree, and we're challenging you, and we're telling you, look, live a different way. But the reality is, we know the deal. You don't even have to look for it. It finds you. So it's not even like you got to go to the drugstore, you got to go to the bar to find that alcohol to medicate you. It finds you. You have access. And so to rewire your thinking and your challenging and your choices, to instead of medicating, but instead meditate on God's word, and to fill your mind and to fill your heart with the truth of what God says changes everything. But there's a challenge. Another thing I mentioned yesterday in the beginning, that whole baseball scenario, remember the Mike Schmidt? Well, that kind of had an interesting bump just this weekend. See, every year my school has like an alumni day, and people come in from all over where they are to kind of come and visit. Well, the guy that was the ringleader of that chant was actually getting inducted into the Sports Hall of Fame for soccer at my school, right? Now it gets better. Turns out, I didn't notice in 7th grade when he was the ringleader of this chant that he would later marry my best friend and from high school, and they had like 3 kids together. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm like, this is kind of wild, right? Like, I'm looking at this dude, and I'm still seeing the guy that was chanting, Mike. And now he's, we're there, and this is a whole different reality. And so I kind of wrestled with that thing a little bit, and eventually I said, you know what? That was a long time ago. I want to be a bigger person and just be happy for this moment. And so I went up to him, and I said, hey, let me get a picture with you and my friend, and we got this picture. So then, right, a funny thing happens. I actually posted on Facebook to say, yo, it's funny how time changes things, right? There's, somebody that was a mortal enemy. This is him. Dan was his name, my friend Jill, right there, and me. And I posted, I said, I'm happy. I'm going to just celebrate in this moment. This is what he posted back in his next line. He responded in the message. He says, you're the man, Rasool. Sorry we were jerks. Thanks for celebrating this moment with me. When you release and you kind of move on, it has this incredible ability to change other people and move things forward and not stay there. But we also see this in the sports context. I mean, NBA finals or conference finals are happening. But it was an incredible story last year with Andre Iguodala. This was a guy over 10 years in the league, gold medalist, all-star game appearances. At some point, with my Sixers, he was the guy when AI retired. And so he signs with the Warriors, and they ask him, hey, we know who you are, Iggy, and we know you're a gold medalist, all-star, and all of that, but we're going to ask you to actually come off the bench. We think that's going to be what's best for the team. And so last year, for the first time in his entire career, he did not start a single game in the regular season. First round of the playoff goes, same thing, second round, third round. So then they finally get to the finals, and they're having a problem with this guy named LeBron James, who's kind of a beast. And so they decide in game 2 or game 3 to insert Andre Iguodala into the lineup. First time he starts the whole year is in the finals. But he was ready when they called his number. And he ends up getting the MVP award for the finals. First time in the history of the NBA that somebody who had never started a game ended up being the MVP. Do you think he got bitter, or do you think he got better? And so when setbacks happen, we have to realize that a setback is just a setup for a comeback. Trusting God in the midst of our suffering is a continual process. I mean, it doesn't end. It's not just like a moment you hear an inspirational message and you go, yo, that's true, so then you move on. The reason why I shared the story about this weekend is that was like 20 years ago when that chant happened and I walked off the field. And I still was wrestling with that thing when I saw the guy. So it's a day-by-day thing. It's a choice that you have to make every day to choose to have the perspective of trusting God and his sovereignty in the midst of our suffering. And that begins today, and it continues the rest of our lives. We need to also cut other people's slack because we don't know what they're going through or what they've been through that might contribute to where they are, and give us ourselves grace as well. And then finally, the third point is redemption. God will redeem our suffering for our good in his glory. He will redeem our suffering for our good in his glory. Well, what does that word redeem mean? It's a deep theological word. I mean, in a sense, it's to take something broken and through payment make it whole again, right? And this ultimately is accomplished, and the best picture of this in Scripture and the climax of human history happens when Jesus Christ himself lives a completely pure, sinless life, sacrifices himself for the sins of the world, and resurrects again so that we can somehow get access into the perfection that he lived and access into the forgiveness of God himself because of his death and his sacrifice on the cross. It's a powerful, this is the theme of redemption runs throughout all of Scripture. The fact that he will buy back. And the interesting thing is that it took suffering for him to get there, but that he can somehow take the things, something as horrific and ugly as the cross, and make it into something transforming and beautiful and worthwhile, which is why many of you, as we were outside, picked a cross as an image that you were going to be your focal point, because it's now a symbol of victory, which was at the time a symbol of defeat. Suffering is a refining process that can produce growth in our lives. It has this amazing ability to do something, when we say refining, right? When like any of the metal that you have, I see some necklaces, some rings, like it doesn't come out the ground like that. It looks like just like a regular rock that has some like little shiny bits. But what they do is they put it in a furnace of heat, and they turn up the temperature, and it takes out all of the impurities so that what is left is pure and beautiful. And that's the same thing that happens in our lives, that sometimes God turns up the heat to get all the junk and all the mess, all the pride, all the ways in which we have that older brother in us. And he whittles it down so that at the end of it, it's something that can give him glory. So suffering reveals character. It can bring Christ-like likeness and maturity. But when we choose to trust Jesus in the midst of suffering, somehow we become more like him. Who wants to be more like Jesus? Raise your hand. Okay. Now, who wants to die on the cross and suffer for, nobody wants to no one wants to experience that. But the reality is, it says that Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered. And that's a mind-blowing thing when it's like, okay, well, Jesus knew everything. But there's some things that you can't just know just through studying. You have to know through experiencing. And there's this ability, and the same thing is true with us, that we learn, we get closer to Jesus, we become more like him when we live as he did and suffered as he did. And it can strengthen us for the next challenge. This is the whole aspect of working out, right? So let me get a couple volunteers here. I need the tallest guys in the room. Here we go. Come on in, guys. Wrong room. Child care is around the corner. Just playing. All right, so I need y'all to lift this up, right? So, let's see. I'm going to try to do pull-up on that, all right? So, all right, suffering. Okay, let's go a little bit shorter then. Just did that. Okay, that's good. No. We don't need that. I want to survive to make the rest of this. All right, here we go. Okay, here we go. So that's one way to get some workout in, right? So that you're doing that, you know what I mean? But, you know, that's only going to get me to so far. If I really want to get stronger, all right, I need to get my weight up. Now, I've never done this before, so hopefully my analogy won't completely fail right now, or the bar won't completely fail. I don't. There's a lot going on. This is teaching without a net right now. Okay. Oh yeah. There we go. So this is a little harder for all of us. Thank you. Give him a card. So thank you. Now, what we just illustrated is a basic principle, right? If I want to get stronger, I need more weight. The more resistance, the stronger that we can get. Now, we get that physically when it comes to our sports, but it's the same thing when it comes to life. When those storms come through, when those hardships happen, when you get that text or that phone call that changes your life, it's an opportunity to get your weight up. Talk to me. Say, get your weight up. Get your weight up. It strengthens us for the next challenge. And then lastly, God's greatness is reflected in how we endure suffering. I don't know if I can get through this now. I'm all messed up. Oh, there we go. I get some help over here. I'm kind of tangled right now. Like, for real. Thank you. There we go. All right. Appreciate it. There we go. Yeah, give it up for him. God uses suffering in the details of our individual lives and stories to bring about his ultimate aims in history. God transforms the sin and suffering of our individual lives into something beautiful in his perfect timing. Now, and here's the biggest truth there, and on your paper you see it. It says God uses the greatest suffering, the cross, to bring about the greatest good for all of humanity, the redemption of all things. And just to kind of give you a picture, because again, this is the Christian truth right here. This is the life that we live. And so this is why it says in Scripture, we shouldn't count it as a strange thing when we experience trials and persecutions and as if something strange is happening to us. But we do kind of see it that way. But we see this picture in sports all the time, and it makes me think of one of the most famous fights of all time. It was called the Rumble in the Jungle. It was between George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. Now, most of y'all have only heard of George Foreman's name about grills. So let me just explain. Before he was that lovable old guy with the $1 million smile, he was a killer, right, in the ring. He was considered to be the heaviest puncher of all time. Now, the setting in 1972 when this fight happened was that Muhammad Ali had been stripped of his title for not participating in the Vietnam War. He hadn't fought in 3 years. And so he was past his prime. George Foreman emerges as, again, like I said, this dominable force that was just no joke and just knocked everybody out. And all of a sudden, they were going to be in the ring together. Now, at this point, it had never happened that a heavyweight fighter had lost his title and got it back again. That never happened. And so the only question that people were asking when this fight took place was, when was George Foreman going to knock Muhammad Ali out? Not if he was going to knock him out. When? And the first few rounds went just as expected. Come out, the bell, ding, and Foreman is just giving it to Ali, just cornering him in the ring. I mean, he's just kind of like leaning back the whole time, and he's just coming at him like a bull and just swinging and swinging and swinging. Ali, round 1, round 2, round 3, almost cradle. If you listen to the commentators, they're kind of like sad, like when you see somebody who was like a great in his prime, but now he's like all washed up. That was kind of how they were talking about what it was looking like in the ring for Ali. And then round 6 and round 7 happened. Then a strange thing happened in round 7. This thing happened where the punches got a little bit slower, and all of a sudden, Ali turns around and punches Foreman and knocks him out. And everyone is shocked. They're like, what just happened? Everyone is just amazed. They can't believe what they just saw. So they interview Ali in the ring, and they say, what happened? What, you were like dying out there. And he was like, oh, that was what I call the rope-a-dope. And they're like, the what? He was like, yeah, the rope-a-dope. See, I took his best punches. I knew he was going to come out strong, and I just wanted to wear him out. And at the opportune time, I went to knock him out. And then I'm like, oh, okay, so this is how redemption works. This is what Jesus accomplished on the cross. I mean, it looked like it was curtains, right? The disciples have gone. He's standing there nailed to a tree, nails in his hands, nails in his feet. He's dead. They're like, yo, we thought he was the one, but he wasn't. Friday was round 1. Saturday was round 2, but then on round 3, he resurrects with all power in his hands and says, I'm the king of the world. I'm the king of the world. And this moment becomes the defining moment of our lives. That's why we wear a cross proudly. That's why we look at this moment. And that's why if God can do that with a perfect man dying on the cross, if he can turn that thing around, then I think he can handle your hamstring pull. I think he can handle you getting benched. I think he can handle something even harder than that. And this is the truth that we live. This is what we hold on to, that God redeems suffering. But the question is, will we choose to lean into him in the midst of it, get bitter or get better? Or we choose to medicate instead of meditating on this truth. Now,